When the first transport trains carrying weary, battle-worn German prisoners of war rolled across the vast expanse of the United States, the men aboard, many of them veterans of brutal campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front, could hardly comprehend what they were seeing as the American heartland unfolded before their eyes, for they had been raised on a steady diet of Nazi propaganda that painted America as a chaotic, racially degenerate land of weak men and crumbling cities, a nation supposedly kept afloat only by Jewish financiers and stolen wealth. And yet, as the trains thundered past endless rows of fertile fields dotted with massive combines, into cities teeming with clean streets, busy workers, and towering steel mills that belched smoke into the sky like industrial dragons, these men realized they had been lied to on a scale more massive than they had ever imagined. And their shock deepened further when they were marched into the POW camps, many of which were converted army training bases with wooden barracks, functioning kitchens, libraries, and even movie theaters, and found themselves not in a wasteland of retribution but in a system that fed them 3 meals a day, allowed them to write home, offered them religious services, and in some cases even let them work in nearby farms or factories for modest wages under the Geneva Convention. And as these men settled into their new and temporary homes, their captors, often GIs not much older than themselves, treated them not with unrelenting cruelty but with a strange and disarming mixture of professionalism and even curiosity. And when some of the German officers began to ask about American war production numbers, about how many tanks, planes, and rifles were being built each week, they expected secrecy or exaggeration, but were instead met with a bluntness that bordered on confidence, because America had nothing to hide, for its industrial output was not a myth but a staggering, visible truth. And soon the POWs were being bussed past aircraft factories the size of small towns, past assembly lines where thousands of men and women, many of them black or female, defying every racial and gender stereotype they had been taught, built B-17 bombers and Liberty ships with a speed and precision that left the Germans dumbfounded. And at night, from the windows of their barracks, they could sometimes hear the distant rumble of trains hauling tanks and trucks westward, an unending rhythm of iron and will that pulsed like the heartbeat of an empire they never truly understood until they were inside it. And the cognitive dissonance of it all was overwhelming. How could a society that allowed so much individual freedom function with such unity of purpose? And how could a nation of immigrants, jazz music, Hollywood films, and Coca-Cola become the hammer that broke the Wehrmacht? And as the months passed, the POWs began to talk among themselves not about escape but about their preconceptions, about the impossibility of ever rebuilding Germany to match what they were seeing here, about the futility of the war they had once believed was noble. And slowly the myths of Nazi superiority began to crumble, replaced by a grudging respect for the American system, not because it was perfect, but because it worked on a scale they had never imagined, because it built not just machines but culture, not just weapons but ideas. And perhaps the most jarring realization came not from what they saw, but from what they didn't, the presence of fear. For in America, they noticed, people spoke freely, newspapers criticized politicians, churches were not co-opted by the state, and even the guards in the camps discussed elections and wages with a frankness that bordered on alien. And the contrast with life under Hitler, where suspicion was a survival tool and silence a virtue, could not have been more stark. And many of these POWs, especially the younger ones, began to internalize these observations, and when offered the chance to attend classes, to read American literature, to interact with local civilians, they seized the opportunity not out of desperation but out of awakening curiosity. And so it was that in towns across Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, German POWs found themselves working side by side with American farmers, helping bring in the wheat harvest that fed Allied armies, and marveling not just at the scale of the tractors and silos but at the cordiality of the farmers, some of whom had lost sons to the very armies these prisoners once fought in, and yet who still offered lemonade and conversation, not vengeance. And these quiet moments of shared labor, of sweat and dust and language barriers overcome by gestures and laughter, did more to dismantle the Nazi worldview than any interrogation ever could. And as the war dragged on and Allied victories mounted, Many POWs began to realize that their futures, whatever they might be, had been permanently altered by what they were witnessing. And when news of the Holocaust finally trickled in through Red Cross bulletins and Allied broadcasts, even the most hardened among them had to confront the abyss into which their nation had fallen. And those who had clung to the idea that they were merely soldiers doing a duty began to question the moral framework that had once seemed so unshakable. And while not all changed, and not all confessed guilt or doubt, many did, quietly and irrevocably. And when the war finally ended and the process of repatriation began, thousands of these men returned to a shattered Germany carrying within them the seeds of a different future, for they had seen a world that contradicted everything they had been taught. And though they were returning to ruins, they brought back glimpses of a society built not on conformity and fear, but on innovation and messy, vibrant democracy. And in the post-war years, many of these former POWs became teachers, engineers, business owners, even mayors, and more than a few returned to America. Some as immigrants, some through exchange programs, some just to visit the farms and towns where they had first encountered a different kind of enemy, one who defeated them not just with guns and bombs, but with factories, freedoms, and a vision of life that turned soldiers into thinkers, skeptics into learners, and captives into witnesses of a reality far more powerful than any ideology they had once served. And so the story of German POWs in America became not just a footnote in history, but a parable of human transformation, of how even in the midst of war, amidst barbed wire and watchtowers, the human mind remains porous, capable of growth, and how industrial might, when married to moral conviction, can do more than win battles. It can shape lives, shift paradigms, and illuminate the difference between power built on fear and power rooted in possibility.